Okay, so we'll just jump right in and get started. My name is David Germano, and I'm here to welcome you to today's talk on behalf of the Contemplative Science Center. We're very happy to have Dr. Candy Brown here from Indiana University. Dr. Brown is a well-known expert on American religion. She has 6 different books to her credit. This include The Word in the World, Evangelical Writing, Publishing, and Reading in America, 1789 to 1880, Testing Prayer, Science and Healing, and Alternative Medicine in Christian America, The Healing Gods, Complementary and Alternative Medicine. No, I think I just combined 2 titles, so I should stick to the main title. Sorry about that. So main titles, let's start again. The Word in the World, Testing Prayer, The Healing Gods, and now Debating Yoga and Mindfulness in Public Schools, Reforming Secular Education, or Reestablishing Religion. And also some edited volumes and a whole host of articles and so forth. And Dr. Brown has also been active not just in scholarly writing, but she's been involved in the past number of years in testifying in various court cases, also doing a lot of kind of public outreach work through blogs and interviews and so forth, and also consultancy work. So we thought when this new book came out earlier in the year, since this is a topic that we have a lot of background and engagement with here at the University of Virginia, it would be good to invite her out here for a constructive dialogue and conversation about these issues. And so we're very grateful that she took time out of her busy schedule to join us here and share her expertise from a historical and religious studies point of view on this topic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Candy Brown.
Well, thank you so much, David, for inviting me out here, and for all of you for taking the time to come. I'm just delighted to be with you and looking forward to conversation together. What I'd like to do in terms of trying to answer this question that I've posed is to look first at some of the legal and the educational context for both the popularity and the controversies that we see with these practices, look at a few case studies, and then just gesture towards some of the larger stakes that are at play here. So starting with a legal context, really we need to go all the way back to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that Congress shall make no law either respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, up until the middle of the 20th century, the courts really did relatively little in terms of trying to monitor what happens in public schools. And in fact, the whole public school system was really built on the advancement of particular forms of religion through the school system. But in the 20th century, there was a shift. And some of the landmark cases to mention here would be Engel versus Vitale of 1962, in which the Supreme Court found that school prayer, even if it is denominationally neutral, even if it is voluntary, is still a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And part of the problem here, according to the court, is that there's an inherent potential for coercion in the school system, even if children are allowed to remain silent, even if they're allowed to leave the room at the time of the exercise. The following year, the court extended its ruling to issues of devotional Bible reading as well as prayer. And the distinction that the Schempp court drew was between teaching about religion as opposed to encouraging the practice thereof. And the court found teaching about religion is not only acceptable, but actually really important because of the cultural and the historical significance of religion. But they wanted to draw a line that encouragement of practice was using government force and authority to endorse either particular versions of religion or religion over non-religion. In the case of Lemon v. Kurtzman, the Supreme Court developed a 3-pronged test for determining whether there was a crossing of this boundary. The particular case involved Catholic parochial schools, and the court found that there was something just inherently promotional about those schools, so that even if there was secular instruction, there was a risk of government endorsement of a religious system, and therefore this was impermissible. So the 3-pronged test is that any government action must have a secular purpose. Regardless of the purpose, the effect, the principle, the primary effect, must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. And third, there must be no excessive government entanglement with religion, recognizing that some kind of religious influence is really pretty much impossible to avoid. So that's the kind of set of Supreme Court tests that were set up. This is then elaborated in other kinds of regulatory law, particularly involving employment. And here important is the role of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and its interpretation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 involving religious discrimination. And what the EEOC determined is that religion needs to be defined broadly to include practice as well as belief. And they were concerned with two kinds of discrimination. First of all, direct, which is a failure to accommodate individual beliefs or practices. But secondly, they were concerned with reverse discrimination, or the imposition of beliefs and practices that might be interpreted as religious by the person upon whom they are imposed. And specifically, the EEOC gave the example of what they referred to as mandatory New Age training programs designed to improve employee motivation, cooperation, or productivity through meditation or yoga. And they found this to be the case even if both the company and other employees viewed the form of meditation as being free from any kind of conflict with religious beliefs. So if an individual employee feels that this is religious to them, the practice cannot be imposed according to these sets of laws. So that's a kind of legal context that then sets a framework for some definitions of religion. Now, the Supreme Court actually hasn't done much to define religion. They've been reticent to do that, but federal appellate courts have been more direct in terms of developing definitions. And there are two important court cases to note. One is that of Malnak v. Yogi in 1979, which was a case involving transcendental meditation and an elective, so voluntary, high school course, so not even very young children. And what the courts found is that even though the promoters of TM insisted that this was science, this isn't religion, that for Establishment Clause purposes, it fit legal definitions of religion. And the reasoning of the court was that if a Roman Catholic is going to be barred from receiving aid from the government, as in that Lemon ruling, so too should be a transcendental meditator. There should be a kind of equivalence in the reasoning of the courts. Second ruling piggybacks off of this one, and it's U.S. v. Myers in 1995. In this instance, the court found that the Church of Marijuana is not a bona fide religion, despite claims that it is, in order to secure free exercise protections. So in both instances, the court made a ruling that conflicted with the evaluation of participants, that something is or is not religious, on the grounds that the court's reasoning was that we can be more objective, and especially when there can be subjective motivations for why you would say something is or is not religious, because you want to get protections or you want to get it into a place where religion is not permitted. So specifically, what comes down through this Malnak-Myers set of rulings is a set of indicia that have been applied widely by other courts subsequently. And there are 5 main components to this. First of all, courts look for an ultimate nature to ideas, for instance, ideas about human nature or humanity's place in the universe. Secondly, is it a comprehensive belief system rather than one isolated teaching? Third, can you find surface signs that are analogous to recognized religions? And Myers enumerated 10 such similarities that you might look for, specifying that you don't have to have all 10 of these or even any of them, but if you do find some of them, that might be a reason to say something looks more religious for legal purposes. So first of all, is there a founder, a prophet, a teacher who's given a kind of divine or enlightened status? Secondly, are there important writings, such as scriptures or mantras? Third, are there gathering places, like churches or even natural environments? Fourth, keepers of knowledge, such as clergy. Fifth, ceremonies or rituals. Sixth, a leadership hierarchy. Seventh, holidays, retreats from the rest of ordinary life. 8th, rules about what do you eat, what do you not eat, when do you eat or not eat. 9th, rules about appearance or clothing. And 10th, propagation, efforts at missions or proselytizing. So then the 4th major indicia would be the presence of metaphysical beliefs about the existence of spirits or deities or intangible forces. And then 5th, are there moral or ethical teachings that are developed into a system for determining what is the good life or what is right or wrong behavior? And so these standards then have been applied in a number of different legal contexts to determine whether something kind of meets a litmus test of being religious or not, again for legal purposes, despite the multiplicity of definitions that are always going to exist in culture more broadly. Now, in addition to this legal context, there's also an important educational context, and it has to do with what's perceived widely as a crisis in American education, with epidemics of stress, obesity, drugs, bullying, violence, underachievement, and oversaturation with technology. These are real problems, and there are definitely areas in which the public education system could be improved. And so part of the appeal of practices like yoga and mindfulness is that they promise to reduce stress, to increase physical activity, to sharpen mental focus. But in addition, there's also a promise that there will be a way of developing moral character, instilling virtues, compassion, kindness, generosity, non-judgment, without crossing these constitutional lines of something being religious. And this is one of the sources of both the popularity and the controversy that then surrounds these practices, is ideas and worries about how moral and ethical teachings are being taught and whether that raises issues of this now being religion, especially when there are contests over the meanings of these categories. So that's the kind of broad context I want to set in terms of law and education. And what I want to do then is look at some very specific case studies, starting with the instance of Ashtanga Yoga. So credited to an Indian Hindu, Sri Krishna Pattabhi Jois of the 20th century, who developed modern Ashtanga or 8-limbed yoga, which consists of moral restraints, ethical observances, focuses largely on postures or asanas. That's kind of what often in American yoga culture, that's what you think of first, are those postures. But then also includes things with breathing, calming the mind, paying attention, meditating, ultimately with the goal of samadhi, which Pattabhi Jois defined very specifically as, in his words, becoming one with God, whom he identified with Brahman. According to Jois, the essence of yoga is to reach oneness with God. And for anyone who practices yoga correctly, and by this he meant just doing the postures or the asanas of yoga, the love of God will develop whether they want it or not. So there's a kind of metaphysical assumption that the practices of yoga are themselves inherently transformative. Therefore, you don't have to talk about all of the 8 limbs. All you do are the postures. And there will be a shifting of beliefs and even, for Jois, of spiritual forces or realities. So this is the premise behind Ashtanga Yoga. There are also characteristic practices. According to Jois, Ashtanga always begins, always ends in the same way. And it always starts with sun salutations, or Surya Namaskara, which Jois defined again very specifically as prayer to the sun god Surya. And his reason for starting with sun salutations is that the postures of yoga have each a presiding deity, and there are over 72,000 such deities in total. So before paying homage to the deities individually through kind of particular asanas, a student of yoga must first begin with salutations to Surya, who according to belief contains the rest of the pantheon. So this is why he always wanted the practice beginning in this way. Likewise, he started the Surya Namaskara with the praying hands or the Anjali Mudra, position of symbolizing union, rising up in prayer and petition, bowing down in surrender and worship, rising up again, remembering that the true sun is within, and thus the sequence of postures. Always Ashtanga ends in lotus or Padmasana, which again is here on a poster used in instruction, and the reason being that it's a posture conducive to meditation and ultimately enlightenment. Part of the lotus position is often this kind of well-known position with the hands, the jnana mudra or wisdom gesture, which in Joyce's kind of teachings is symbolic of subordinating the individual consciousness to the universal consciousness. So there's a very intentional kind of framing of the practices of Ashtanga Yoga and this important kind of symmetry where you begin and you end in this certain fashion. So how does this come into the context of public education and legal controversies? And the story here is that there was a lawsuit over Ashtanga Yoga in a California school district in Encinitas, which is a kind of a part of San Diego, California. Pattabhi Jois first visited Encinitas in 1975. One of his students invited him there. He brought his son Manju with him. Manju never left. He stayed since 1975. He married. His wife Nancy became a kindergarten teacher in the Encinitas Union School District, or EUSD. Sonia and Paul Tudor Jones, who is well known among the CSC folks around here, funded the Joyce Foundation in 2011. And offered a $500,000 grant to the district. Ultimately, this turned into over $4 million over the course of 5 years. And specifically, the terms of the grant was that the school district had to teach Ashtanga Yoga and develop a transferable curriculum. Joyce, the foundation, and the school district worked together in terms of the selection, the training, and the supervision of yoga teachers for the school. Together, they wrote the curriculum. And here are some of the features of the pilot program, which was taught by one Jennifer Brown in 2011 to 2012. So Brown would always give character teachings, 5 to 7 minutes, little talks that she said she grounded in the yamas and the niyamas from the Yoga Sutras. The students always began with sun salutations. They practiced different postures in the Ashtanga primary series, lotus and corpse or resting pose, all taken from the Joyce Institute Ashtanga instructional poster. She taught from a textbook, The Myths of the Asana, which describes the postures of yoga as symbolizing various gods. She also led students in chanting Om, placing their hands in jnana mudra, which was extra credit in her classes. Children meditated in lotus. She taught them Sanskrit terminology, and she showed them a clip from the film Ashtanga New York, in which Pattabhi Jois is leading a large group in Surya Namaskara. The program was rolled out district-wide the following year. Teachers used construction paper to make a poster of an 8-limbed Ashtanga tree. They labeled each of the 8 branches in Sanskrit. The curriculum included guided meditation scripts, and children were asked to color mandalas. Christian and Hindu parents complained that they saw religion in these practices in the program. The school district responded by removing the Sanskrit and removing what they called cultural references to India. In the spring of 2013, when this program was going into trial, children were still starting off their practice with sun salutations, concluding with lotus and rest, and using the praying hands and the wisdom hands gestures. Even though the teachers stopped using Sanskrit, the children still did. So for instance, they would greet each other with namaste, which often in American yoga culture is translated the divine in me, bows to the divine in you. They spoke about shavasana for corpse pose. They sat in lotus, they closed their eyes to meditate, they placed their hands in jnana mudra, and they chanted Om. One of the promoters of the Encinitas yoga program is one Eddie Stern. He was introduced to the court as Health and Wellness Project Manager, New York. And here is how he was presented in a video introduced into evidence at trial by the school district.
The position that we hold our body in affects our mind, and the mind then affects our behavior, and our behavior then affects our outcomes. And then if we have positive outcomes, we're likely to have greater success in the things we set out to do in our lives. So what we've done is we've taken this idea and we have modeled a health and wellness program based on the...
Okay, so this is all that the court was told about Eddie Stern, who's a narrator for the video and speaks as what we have done with this program. What the court was not told by the school district is that Stern also was a long-term student, in fact certified instructor of Ashtanga Yoga, student of Joyce, ran Ashtanga Yoga New York, a shala, inside of which he ran the Broome Street Ganesha Temple. In 2012, the year before the Encinitas trial, Stern opposed a New York State sales tax on yoga, arguing that this was a dedicated spiritual and religious discipline and therefore deserved free exercise protection and should not be taxed. And when he succeeded, he credited Ganesh as the remover of obstacles, even obstacles like the tax department. In 2013, same year as the yoga trial, Stern appeared in a video posted on YouTube in which he portrays his practice of yoga in this manner.
I think we're definitely multi-denominational and we're all across the board. Like, I'm Jewish. I've never converted to Hinduism. I'm quite happy being Jewish, but it just so happens that I really like worshiping Ganesh and all the gods, and so that's what I do for my spirituality. And I think that if devotion is taken towards the central aspect of a person's search or undertaking, then they're very happy to meet people of other denominations also who are seeking in the same type of a way.
Okay, so same approximate time period, Stern presents himself in two very different ways in relation to yoga, but the court only heard one aspect of Stern's presentation. So here are some other kind of instances of children in the Encinitas Union School District practicing yoga. And one of the questions here is this exercise? Is there something religious that's going on here? And I'll call attention to this particular picture of a field trip to the Self-Realization Fellowship, which is in downtown Encinitas, founded by Yogananda in the 1930s. And it was right around the time of trial that students from EUSD took a field trip there, and they started to sit down and meditate in lotus position. Now, this also never made it into the trial record, partly because this was designed as a 2-hour bench trial, so there wasn't discovery, and the attorney for the plaintiffs in this trial actually didn't know how to introduce things into evidence, such as the Eddie Stern second video or the picture. And in a few moments, I'll talk about how that level of legal experience and the financial kinds of levels actually come into play in how trials kind of unfold and how legal precedents are set. But I'll just mark that for right now. So the case itself, Sedlock v. Baer, decided initially in 2013, went to appeal in 2015. The judge determined that yoga is religious. That's a quote from the ruling. But then the question arises, is it constitutionally permissible? And his answer was yes. The reason being that, according to the judge, EUSD removed anything that could be arguably deemed religious. His primary example was that the so-called lotus position was renamed crisscross applesauce. So by the judge's reasoning, if you relabel a practice, it is no longer religious. Now, one issue here is that if you read the curriculum at EUSD at the time of trial, the word lotus appears 194 times. I counted. The word crisscross applesauce never once appears in the promotional videos that were submitted into evidence by EUSD. Again, you see the word, or you hear the word lotus a number of times. You don't actually hear the word crisscross applesauce, but the judge was convinced that the practice of yoga itself was inherently secular, and it's just a matter of labeling and naming that determines whether religion is present or not. And so his conclusion was that a reasonable student would not objectively perceive that EUSD yoga either advances or inhibits religion, and therefore it is constitutionally permissible. Now, this is wasn't the first time there had been a controversy over yoga in a public school district or where relabeling came into play. One instance was in 2002 when Yoga Ed overcame school board resistance to a yoga program by relabeling. So samadhi became oneness, meditation became time in, and pranayama became bunny breathing. The evaluation at the time of that instance by Hinduism Today, the magazine, was that this was an instance of a Vedic victory. Because according to that kind of group of Hindus, it's the practices, it's not the wording that matters. So much like Joyce, the practices themselves are transformative. And so they weren't worried about some relabeling. So I want to turn, actually now, to another example of yoga in public schools, superbrain yoga. And here's kind of how it's done in a Missouri school. But where it became a legal controversy was actually in Pennsylvania, proposed as the basis for a charter school. It was Education for New Generations Charter School versus the North Penn School District. I was involved in this case as well. This time I was testifying for the school board or for the school district as opposed to for the parents. And it involved a set of practices developed by a master Choa Kok Sui from the Philippines. And he developed a system of modern pranic healing and arhatic yoga, the goal of which was God realization. He drew here on various teachings and practices from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. And one of the signature practices was superbrain yoga. Critics pointed out that this wasn't really all that innovative because there was a long-standing practice in India, Thapakaranam, to hold ears, which is a ritual of devotion to Ganesh. But here's how it was taught by MCKS. You face east towards the gods, you connect your tongue to your palate in order to direct the spiritual energy channels, invoke for divine blessing, spread your feet, squeeze your right ear, and the ear is important because it looks like an inverted fetus, therefore it's a microcosm of the body. You use your left thumb and index finger, cross your arms in order to connect with the higher soul, squat to inhale, stand to exhale, release, repeat and release, moving energy from the sex chakra up to the heart chakra and up to the crown chakra. And this is what raises intelligence. So you get smarter, your brain becomes super by doing these practices rather than by studying. And then you end with a prayer of thanksgiving. So one of the co-founders of this charter school was a medical doctor, pediatric surgeon by the name of Dr. Glenn Mendoza. And the year before he helped to start this charter school proposal, he was involved in a legal matter in which he argued that he should not be fired from his hospital job for practicing pranic healing and arhatic yoga because it was a devoted spiritual practice rooted in religion and ancient spiritual teachings of meditation. It is no different than being Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Catholic, or Muslim. So when free exercise of religion was at stake, this is religion. When it's a school, it's education. This did not convince the Charter Appeal Board of the Pennsylvania Board of Education. And what they did is they voted 6-0 to rescind a charter that they had actually been poised to grant. So the key point here is that this almost became a charter school. But there was a 2-week window after the appeal board granted the charter in which the school district could appeal the petition. And a parent found these links to pranic healing and arhatic yoga, called them attention to the school district, called the attention to the appeal board. And the school district stood to lose $1 million a year if this charter school were open, just because of the dynamics. You take funds, funds follow students. So if students leave for the charter school district has less in Pennsylvania. So the school district was motivated for any reason to oppose this charter school. And so they did so when they had the opportunity, and then the charter was rescinded for the reason that even before going to the First Amendment, state law is that public schools, charter schools included, must be non-sectarian and they must engage in no religious instruction. So was superbrain yoga in Pennsylvania more religious than Ashtanga yoga in California? Having looked closely at both of these programs, I actually don't think so. I do think that the school districts had more resources than the kind of their legal opponents in both cases, and I do think they had financial reasons. One district stood to gain $4 million, another district stood to lose millions of dollars, and there was a level of legal expertise that the attorneys for the school districts had that the other attorneys simply didn't have. And so what I want to call attention to here is that this isn't all about whether religion is there or not, but there are also matters of legal training, and there are matters of finances that come into play in how practices are named, and thus in how we read legal precedents and what the foundation of those precedents is. Okay, so I want to transition here to mindfulness-based stress reduction. Popularized by one Jon Kabat-Zinn, a molecular biology PhD who founded the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. Kabat-Zinn acknowledges that he was trained as a Dharma teacher, but he's explained in recent years that he would not have been able to do what I did in quite the same way if I was actually identifying myself as a Buddhist. Dharma teacher, yes. Buddhist, no. Talking to audiences that he sees as sympathetic, he gives this origin story for MBSR. He says that he was on a retreat at the Insight Meditation Center and he had a flash of insight to take the heart of something as meaningful, as sacred, if you will, as Buddha Dharma, and to bring it into the world in a way that does not dilute, profane, or distort it, but at the same time is not locked into a culturally and tradition-bound framework that would make it absolutely impenetrable to the vast majority of people. Thus, he found the term mindfulness very useful because it had a flexibility, a capacity to do double duty. It sounded just commonsensical. It's just paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. But at the same time, it could function as an umbrella term, one that he saw as capable of subsuming all of the other elements of the Eightfold Noble Path. It was the heart of Buddhist meditation and the essence of the Buddhist teaching. Stress, likewise, sounded like a medical diagnosis at the same time that it's a way of translating dukkha, or suffering. Thus, MBSR for Kabat-Zinn is skillful means for bringing the Dharma into mainstream settings. Thus, both MBSR and MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, were for Kabat-Zinn secular, but Dharma-based, portals into the deeper teachings of what he identified as the essence of Buddhist meditation. The underpinnings of MBSR, according to senior leaders, are squarely within Buddhism. It is a full expression of the essence of the Dhamma, or the Dharma. It embodies the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. The origin of suffering is craving or attachment. Suffering can be ended through a specific path. The Noble Eightfold Path, which includes right mindfulness. MBSR embodies the four foundations of mindfulness from classical Buddhist texts. It embodies the three marks of existence, the three poisons, the three jewels, the four virtues. And thus, without ever talking about Buddhism, you can convey these essential Buddhist ideas and teachings in a way that for Kabat-Zinn would be transformative. Goldie Hawn is another popularizer of mindfulness in education. Her foundation authored the Mind Up curriculum published by mainstream educational publisher Scholastic Books. Hawn herself started with transcendental meditation, to which she added mindfulness. And here is how she describes her curriculum for the Dalai Lama Center for Peace Education.
We have to be able to bring contemplative practice into the classroom under a different name, because obviously people that say, oh, meditation, they think, oh, this is Buddhist or this is whatever. Well, His Holiness absolutely doesn't have any denomination on this. About 20 years ago, I went to His Holiness, and he gave me my mantra. I'm a producer. I'm going to put this show on the road. And I brought the script written, and I call it a script because it is. It's one step how the story gets told, on how you're able to facilitate the best part of you. It's karma. And they love it. And now, as you know, we are in a bunch of countries because of here. So this is where it all started.
Okay, so it starts at the Dalai Lama Center. Mind Up is a script, according to Han. She replaces systematically terms like Buddhism and meditation with neuroscience and core practice in order to get Buddhist meditation into the classroom under a different name. So we see the same relabeling, both with the yoga examples and this example of mindfulness. So here is how she presents this as neuroscience. I use my brain to learn. Here are other instances of mindfulness in public school and charter school classrooms, and charter schools are public schools in terms of law. And here you see the common practice, for instance, of using what get described as Tibetan singing bowls to guide meditative practices. Another of the influential mindfulness and education groups is Mindful Schools, started in San Francisco. And here's a clip from how they describe the companion of mindfulness, heartfulness, which is a way of interpreting metta-meditations, which are common in many Buddhist contexts. And so here's a film from 2013.
Did everybody get their name? Is Aiden here? No? Jalen's not here. Winnie? No, Aaliyah? Oh, great. Tavian, put on top of the cubby right there, okay? And I'll turn it in for you. Okay. I want you to first picture Aiden in your mind. Now I want you to picture Jalen. Really picture him. And now I want you to say, may you be happy. May you be healthy. And may you be peaceful. Whenever we have somebody that's absent in here, and I know it's because they're sick, we actually stop in the morning and we close our eyes and we send good thoughts to that person. And there's something about that action of stopping and noticing that somebody who is a part of our community is not here, and it's because they're not feeling well.
It could be somebody who has already passed, too. Think of that person, close your eyes, and have that person right in front of you. May you be happy. May you be healthy.
Okay, so you fold your hands, you send good thoughts at a distance or even across the lines of the living and the dead, right? Because it can be someone who has passed or died that you send these good thoughts to. So some promoters of practices such as this use the term stealth Buddhism for what they are engaging in. This is true of Trudy Goodman, one of Kabat-Zinn's disciples, as she's interviewed by Buddhist Geeks.
I really wanted us to be able to work in this community, to go into hospitals and universities and schools and places where as Buddhists we might not be so welcome, especially state places, which is appropriate since we have the separation of church and state. The question, the really interesting question is, what do they do after they take that class? And, you know, the reality is they aren't that different from our Buddhist classes. We just use a different vocabulary. And the question of will people then sort of migrate into Buddhism, some will, some won't. Anyone who practices sincerely, and whether they want it or not, they're going to discover more deeply other dimensions of their being. I think it's inevitable if they keep practicing. Don't you?
Yeah, that seems to be somewhat independent of whether it's framed in a Buddhist context or in a new non-Buddhist Buddhist context.
My former husband, George, he used to call it crypto-Buddhism, you know.
That's it.
Stealth Buddhism, we now might say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the stakes of presentations such as this one? Is this science? Is it religion? So I want to kind of talk just a bit about this. The scientific evidence, if you look at studies, is weaker than a lot of the media hype and enthusiasm over some of these practices. Many studies use small sample sizes without blinding or randomization or active control groups. There are studies in which individuals report by self-report measures lower stress, but if you look at the cortisol levels, they actually indicate higher stress. Systematic reviews exist which suggest that some of these practices may be no better than physical education or cognitive behavioral therapy. There are also reports in the literature of challenging or adverse effects, including increases in anxiety and depression, physical pain, the reliving of traumatic memories, increases in aggression and suicidality. Even Kabat-Zinn's Center for Mindfulness recognizes contraindications such as a history of trauma, PTSD, abuse, depression, suicidality, addiction, or other psychological disorders. There also is a scientific literature of the benefits of alternatives, producing many of the same benefits actually claimed for yoga or mindfulness. For instance, there's aerobic exercise, taking a nap, listening or playing music, doing math or other challenging activities, or even just eating a healthy lunch. But more the point is that practices may very well be robustly, scientifically validated as effective. They work in particular ways and yet meet definitions of religion. You might point to Christian prayer or church attendance, and there have been studies showing health benefits to such practices. One of the findings from research on yoga and mindfulness is that there seems to be a correlation between length and frequency of practice, even of the secularized versions, and changes in beliefs and affiliations. Anecdote: Kristen, Catholic college student who started with physical aspects of yoga. Over time, she decided that the 8 limbs of Ashtanga are basically similar to the 10 Commandments, but she liked them better because they were just like suggestions. Or there's this individual who reported that I took an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course 2 years ago without knowing anything about Buddhism. The program spurred my curiosity, and here I am learning all about the Four Noble Truths. In one study of yoga practitioners, most students, 62%, 84% of teachers, changed their motive over time, generally from stress reduction and exercise towards spirituality, which became a primary motive for 24% of students, 50% of teachers, and a secondary motive for 48% of students and 50% of teachers. In a study of secularized MBSR, 90% started the program wanting improvements in mental health, 89% stress relief, 61% physical health, about 50% wanted to deepen their spirituality. More than this number, however, 54% reported that they experienced changes in spirituality through this secularized mindfulness program. And they were defining spiritualities including things like personal faith, meaning, connection to a higher power, or sense of being interconnected with all beings. What the study authors concluded was that the mental health benefits they detected were resulting from increases in spiritual experiences. It was only because there was this secular spiritual continuum that you saw these mental health effects. Study of yoga, comparing shorter and longer term practitioners after 1 year, 43% self-reported to be Christian, 23% spiritual but not religious, and 4% Buddhist. After 6 or 7 years, 28% identified as Christian, so a reduction, 31% as spiritual but not religious, increase, 9% as Buddhist. Only 19% initially saw yoga as spiritual, but over time, yoga became a spiritual path for 43%. Study of long-term meditators. After an average of 17 months, 20% were monotheists, 60% were religious nuns, and 20% were Buddhists. After an average of 105 months, 13% were monotheists, so decrease, 25% were nuns, decrease actually, 38% were Buddhists, and 25% affiliated themselves with all religions. risks that might be in play here would be cultural appropriation, cultural imperialism. Many of the promoters of programs are wealthy Caucasians who claim to remove, in their language, the cultural baggage in order to distill what they determine to be the essence of religious practices, and their programs often promotionally and financially target Blacks and Latinos as especially needing these practices. So we might detect here both positive Orientalist stereotypes as the ancient East as wiser, more spiritual, but then also patterns of racial disciplining based on negative stereotypes. Many of the promotional videos prominently feature male students of color. And the language used in many of these materials is about managing classroom behavior and improving the self-regulatory capacities of students who were more lacking in those capacities. Ironically, Blacks and Latinos are statistically more religiously active and Christian than program promoters, and may already have spiritual resources and coping mechanisms and may not be in the market for new resources. Another instance or risk here is that of coercion. There are certain Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, and some Hindus and Buddhists who object to school programs because they perceive them as religious and or as harmful. For instance, for many practitioners, their interpretation, rightly or wrongly, is that sun salutations feel like idolatry to them, bowing down to the sun god Surya. They can't in good conscience do it. There are also really conflicting assumptions about the nature of the self and the world. For many Christians, for instance, life isn't suffering, life is good. Suffering isn't caused by craving or aversion, it's caused by disobedience to God. One should judge things. Non-judgmental isn't an ideal. You should judge what's obedience, what's disobedience. One should desire what is good. One should hate what is evil. The self is permanent, created in the image of God for eternal relationship. One should remember the past and hope for the future. One should sacrificially embrace suffering. And compassion stems from a sense of being different from the other rather than interconnected with everyone and everything. So there's these really conflicting models or assumptions even about the nature of reality rather than it just being self-evident that a certain set of ideas is true. There are conscientious objectors, for instance, teachers in British Columbia and California who have lost their classrooms because they refused to teach mindfulness. In one instance, it drove a teacher into crises from her own PTSD experiences. In another instance, there's just concern about the effects on children, so they gave up their classrooms. Opting out may not avoid this kind of coercive potential because there are subtle indirect influences analogous to those with prayer and devotional Bible reading. There's teacher authority, peer pressure, mandatory attendance laws, especially when practices aren't just in a PE class, but it might be 3 times daily or a part of the entire school culture. Many program leaders have a goal of mandatory participation. This is true of leaders of the Joyce, Sonima, Pure Edge Foundation, the goal of which is to require yoga and meditation competency for teacher credentialing and is an essential component of the education system. MindUp's mission is to be absolutely mandated. My take on all of this is to redefine secularization as transparency and as voluntarism. This is because naming and choosing one's assumptions about the self and the world can enhance one's agency to act without being controlled by unstated assumptions. There can be value in disclosing religious ties and potential effects of even secularized practices out of respect for cultural and religious diversity. There can be advantages to discussing strengths and weaknesses of scientific evidence because there are risks of challenging or adverse effects, contraindications, and alternatives. I would propose a voluntary opt-in model of informed consent because opt-ins are a lot more active than the kind of passive consent given in an opt-out system. You have to think about and choose rather than being guided by herd instincts or the lowest resistance route. And I think this provides more protection for the rights of personal autonomy and self-determination. I suggest then, finally, a few best practice recommendations. Starting with one-on-one informed consent interviews. Yes, these take time, they are more resource intensive, but they allow program leaders to take into account personal backgrounds, goals, values, experiences. Limit instruction and practice to designated times that aren't a part of the school day or the work day in employment contexts. Be careful of metaphysical connotations, for instance, of concepts such as non-duality, impermanence, interconnection, language like loving kindness or metta, or even relabeled as heartfulness, chakras, mantras, om, symbols like Tibetan singing bowls, Zenergy chimes, or mandalas, gestures, praying hands, wisdom gesture, gazing points, or postures that in many contexts are associated with veneration of deities or enlightenment, sun salutations, lotus, corpse. Finally, my suggestion might be to accommodate objections whether or not you think these objections are grounded in a thorough knowledge of practices or histories. So even if you're sure it's secular, a safer ethical and legal ground might be to respect, acknowledge, and accommodate the positions and the beliefs of those that might differ from one's own in promoting such programs. So if you'd like more information, I've written a bit about some of these issues, and I would welcome a conversation with all of you.
In the latter part, in the end, you focused on concerns regarding metaphysical beliefs that might somehow be transmitted, or the eventuality that people might become associated officially with a kind of Buddhist or Hindu tradition. But it seems like in the court cases, the concern was primarily with the way these practices, even when very consciously and intentionally separated from the transmission of metaphysical beliefs or formal association with a religious tradition, could be traced back, both abstractly in history as well as for the practitioner, the educator, or the founder, to a particular religious or spiritual tradition. So focusing on that, since that seemed to be the crux of the court cases, my question is, isn't it the case that most of the practices that you see in elementary schools surrounding who we should be and how we should treat each other, how we should live. You know, the focus, for example, in most elementary school classrooms on kindness as opposed to, for example, valor, and equality between students as opposed to, for example, hierarchical respect within the classroom based on students' backgrounds and positions in society, would, according to many religious studies scholars, be traced back to the eventual secularization of Christian beliefs and values. And that perhaps, even though the third grade teacher might say, oh no, these are secular practices, I want children to be kind, and I want them to treat each other as equals, you might be able to find a video of her talking about how for her, actually, it's rooted in the love of Christ, in which we're all equal in the eyes of God.
Right.
And that religious studies scholars might be able to talk about how the priority of kindness and equality is in fact rooted in Christian values over time that have become secularized. So is it possible that the particular the sensitivity toward practices that have been separated from Hindu and Buddhist traditions and their rootedness in those traditions is both because they're foreign and because they're more recent in their secularization?
Okay. So great question. Let me try and rephrase that, and you can see if I'm mangling your question as I try to do that. So there's one set of issues that I've touched on in terms of how performance of secularized practices can lead to changes in beliefs and affiliations. But one of the other issues that's come up in legal challenges is the history of practices and ties to religion. And so you observe that there are Christian origins to a lot of practices and values, but with Hindu, Buddhist kind of derivations, they're both more recent, and there is a kind of concern, kind of fear of foreign people, foreign religions that goes into that controversy. Is that kind of getting at the question? So very, very thoughtful, very reflective practice. So let me just focus then on your question about origins. So in terms of the legal dimensions of both the prayer rulings and the transcendental meditation rulings, and even this California case, the core issue was not actually historical origins or rootedness. The legal standard here is one of the principal or primary effect, which also gets elaborated as the question of endorsement. And so really the question is the government kind of backing of the practice going to have the effect of endorsing a religious tradition, regardless of whether there's this kind of someone will become like a different religion over time? So in that sense, the historical origins don't really matter in terms of the endorsement. The key question is, what are the ongoing ties and associations? And so the recency does actually come into play here because there often are more ongoing associations with recency. The terms mindfulness and yoga are kinds of signposts, and intentionally for some of these program promoters. So for instance, one of the kind of phrases that comes out in some of this literature is, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to recognize where mindfulness comes from. All you have to do is Google the term and you'll find kind of these other associations. Or you'll find language about wanting to whet children's appetite so that when they're outside of this third grade classroom, very simplified practices, they'll find out more about the real meaning or the deeper meaning of that practice. So for some of the promoters, they want to have kind of what you can do in the secular classroom because they do want a kind of endorsement of that practice. Now, I do want to acknowledge, I think you're exactly right in terms of where there have been legal controversies. Is there a kind of xenophobia? Is there a kind of Christian bias? I think, yeah. This is the case. I mean, in the Encinitas case, there were Hindus who objected. There were atheists who objected. The plaintiffs were very much evangelical Christians. They didn't really know a lot about yoga. They certainly didn't know a lot about Ashtanga Yoga or about Hinduism. And there was a sense of, we don't want our children in that. So I think that's true. But really the legal question is there an endorsement of the practice or the tradition, regardless of the question of what the long-term effects of participation might be?
Endorsement by the educator or by the school district or by?
Well, so the question is endorsement by whom, the educator or the school district, any sort of government entity or individual. And so in terms of legal definition, that means teacher who's employed by the school district. It means the school district itself, because these are now agents of state and they have the authority and the backing of the government behind them.
Again, thank you for your talk. This is kind of following up on the response to that question. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. Could one argue, though, that endorsements by these groups are necessary in order for these things to become part of the mainstream? Because these people are coming from the minority perspective, the minority backing, and we don't need explicit Christian groups to endorse the practice of teaching kindness in the classroom and all of that, because the majority of teachers come from a Christian background, because these are the values that have been in our culture for 200 years.
Yeah, so the question being that, don't we need to have a kind of special privileging, you might even say a kind of affirmative action for practices that have more of a Buddhist or a Hindu derivation than a Christian derivation, because these are minorities. So is that kind of, so yeah, so So the legal question, and again, legal definitions aren't perfect, but working with what we have in terms of where the law stands on these issues, the legal question is not should we favor minority positions or give a leg up to minority religious positions versus kind of majority positions. The question is there a promotion, an advancement and inhibition of any kind of religion or religion over non-religion? Because the Supreme Court's position has been that schools as government entities should be neutral. Now, is that ever possible? No, of course not. But so legally, there's been question about, so should there be dual definitions of religion in the First Amendment, where if something is arguably religious, then you should have protections for free exercise, but if there are kind of more long-standing associations, you should keep that out for kind of more established traditions like Christianity. And the court has found that kind of dual definition is legally problematic, that there's one word religion, and actually even Lawrence Tribe, constitutional law professor at Harvard, who literally wrote the textbook on constitutional law, his first edition in 1978 argued for that dual definition of religion using the Malnak v. Yogi case as his key example. When he revised this in 1988, he reversed his position, and he said that is not a tenable position to take. And thus, it's been kind of this position of if a Roman Catholic is denied aid by the government, so too must be a transcendental meditator. So that's the legal standard, is that there needs to be an equality, even if kind of we collectively or some segments of society think that it's been too long of Christian dominance and it's time to have more kind of roles at play.
I guess my question wasn't about them, the government supporting one religious view and not another. It was the question of if we have these views that are backed by a religion, but the Christian views backed by the religion isn't explicitly supported by a Christian group, whereas these views backed by a different religion have groups that are actively supporting them. How can we use the fact that a group is actively supporting it as to determine that this idea is an unpermissible one?
Yeah, so then the refinement being that we're not talking about government endorsement, but you're going to have more, say, Hindu groups or Buddhist promoters who say kind of this is the value, whereas Christians don't need to because it's so already in the culture. I think that there's an aspect that there is a lot that's just in the culture, which is what religious studies scholars like to point to, ways that Christianity is just there and it looks secular, but it's actually very Christian. Still, the legal question isn't about endorsement by other groups. The question is, what is the position taken by the state in regards to those practices? Yeah, Tish?
There's a long I have no voice.
Yeah.
There's a long history in education of promoting values in terms of kindness, and there's also been a history of practices that have been secularized a long time ago that are being used today. They've been kind of lumped into this mindfulness controversy. And I just want to point that out.
Yeah.
As a former Montessori teacher,
Sure.
I taught kids to be silent as a practice, to listen. And later might be called mindfulness. I'm talking talking 80s, before anyone was using the word mindfulness. So I think it's really important to distinguish previously secularized or may never have been associated with religion that are beneficial to kids, that help kids manage their emotions, help them be more aware of their behavior, and more compassionate and caring for other people, that don't fit into these categories that you're describing.
Yeah. So the comment being that there are many practices that don't really fit the model that I've been talking about in terms of derivation, maybe Christian, maybe not Christian, maybe kind of just other sorts of values. And I would agree. and agree that it's important to recognize that there often is kind of a reframing, a remobilizing, sort of a connecting between ideas and practices, partly because of marketing. I think, right? Something you may have always done a kind of reflective practice, but now if you call it mindfulness, you'll get more appeal and more buy-in to that practice because that becomes a kind of brand name that goes with it. I think that's true, and that raises a lot of kind of other issues that are worth talking about. Yeah, I saw your hand before. Yeah.
Thank you. Your talk is very interesting and wonderful. I have two short questions. Do you see Buddhist culture, religion, and Buddhism, is it the same? Or my second short question is, the Buddhism is it a religion or psychology?
Right.
Philosophy or science? I mean, if it's not,
Right.
no need to talk.
Right. So is Buddhist culture the same as Buddhist religion? Is that the
Culture, religion, and Buddhism.
right? So is Buddhist culture a religion, or is Buddhist culture the same as Buddhism, and is Buddhism a religion?
Yeah, Buddhist culture, religion, and Buddhism. Is these two are same or not?
Right. So there are a lot of different interpretations of what Buddhism is, and I mean this is partly why there are sharp critics of someone like Kabat-Zinn who are ordained Buddhist leaders, right, who have real problems with how he interprets what Buddhism is, kind of determining this is the essence of Buddhism, or this is kind of the cultural baggage that we want to, and so there's much that's deeply problematic, and this is what I'm trying to gesture towards in noting risks of cultural appropriation, is that there are many Buddhisms. And so kind of this Americanized version, or the say just this Kabat-Zinn version of what Buddhism is definitely not all of Buddhism. Now the question of is Buddhism a religion, there's a long history to this. The term Buddhism, it comes out of colonialist encounters. I mean, this goes back to 19th century and beyond and before, and there have long been discussions. Is this science? Is it philosophy? Is it religion? And the courts have determined that Buddhism counts as a religion. Now that might not be what others kind of would conclude, so I don't want to gloss what's actually a much more complicated subject here. But in terms of legal definitions, that's been kind of the legal standard. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your talk. I teach a seminar in the history of yoga, actually, and we always do a unit on the Sedlock v. Baird case.
Oh, interesting, yes.
Provided, and we're using your book next semester. So I wanted to ask, on the legal side of things, wrestling with definitions, whether have the courts engaged with the term spirituality? Because obviously, right with the framing the Constitution, there's this binary of religion, non-religion, and nowadays we have very much in public space this idea of a category of spiritual but not religious. So now we seemingly have three categories.
Right.
And arguably for spiritual, you could imagine other synonyms, right? People like our center here saying, contemplative, but not religious. So we should have contemplation in the classroom, or spiritual. Have courts had to wrestle with this kind of rise?
Right. So have courts had to wrestle with the rise in this third category of spirituality versus religion or secularity? And the answer is the courts have done very little along those lines. I mean, I really think that legal reasoning is still very much in its infancy when it comes to anything besides Christian prayer and Bible reading. That's what most of the analysis has been, including in constitutional law textbooks on these matters. Now, there are certainly a lot of debates among religious studies scholars, but there are influential such scholars who would argue that if you use a kind of functional definition of religion, spirituality works in a lot of the same ways that religion does. If you look at the language of the Constitution, if you want to define something as spiritual for Establishment Clause purposes, then that puts you in a bind unless you go with dual definitions that there's no protection of spirituality for free exercise purposes. So in that way, it can recognizing that there's a history, there's a context, right? There's negative connotations to the word religion. A lot of evangelical Christians would not say they are religious. They have relationship. They don't have religion. No one likes that term, religion. And there's these political, there's these financial reasons for wanting to take these terms. So this is something very much that the courts need to grapple with. And I mean, in a sense, this gets back to the question of, well, is Buddhism a religion? Because if we can define Buddhism as something other than religion, then hey, no problem. But then you also have the issue of, well, you also don't have protection of Buddhism if it's not defined as religion by the courts. Yeah.
Something I was struck by in the talk and in some of your publications on this is a potential tension between sort of the like Kabat-Zinn's language of skillful means and Joyce's language of sort of people are developing their love of God when they're doing these practices, and then your list of best practices where you're suggesting removing some of the language and removing some of the symbolism.
Right. Is it good enough?
Yeah.
I don't think, okay, so the question is, so if someone like Joyce or Kabat-Zinn is arguing that the practice itself is transformative, is removing language and is removing gestures enough? And I actually don't think that it is. And this is where, well, what do you recommend as best practices? And I mean, really, I think where I ultimately want to land with this is with the opt-in model of informed consent. And and where I think whenever you're talking about adding, subtracting, what I really want to try and get my head around or kind of have a conversation about is how can you rebuild from foundations that name and interrogate the assumptions behind those practices and those labels. Because as long as you're stopping with adding and subtracting, whether it's a Tibetan singing bowl or whether it's kind of the label mindfulness itself, that doesn't really get at those more fundamental issues. Yeah, David?
So a couple of things. One, just incidentally, Tibetan singing bowls are not Tibetan.
I know, they're totally not Tibetan. That's why I say what are called. And they're also not ancient.
What is profoundly religious in Tibetan is one of your favorite activities, which is debate. So, just point that out.
Yeah.
Not to criticize all your debate.
No, that's fascinating.
So, two things I wanted to ask about, or just note about, but one is to follow up on Michael's comments about spirituality. You make a lot of references in the book, and you made some today, to saying, you know, this practice is inherently transformative, and then cite different kinds of anecdotal evidence and some surveys that suggest it's transformative in a way that leads you to spirituality and so forth. And, you know, two things. One is sometimes when you talk that way, I kind of thought of the way a lot of the advocates of mindfulness and so forth talk about how, oh, it changed the brain, like everything changes the brain.
Right.
You know? Like everything is transformative.
Right, everything's transformative.
But
everything
particularly the
brain.
thing about the way you point out these anecdotes, how it leads to spirituality, and you seem to want to get some mileage out of that. But I could show you so many anecdotes about how running leads to spirituality,
Yes.
music leads to spirituality, math leads to spirituality, physics leads to spirituality, nature experience leads to spirituality. So if we start using that as a criteria of action stuff out of the educational system,
Yeah.
we're going to be left with throwing balls at each other or something.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a really important point. So that if my argument is there is a correlation between participation in a secularized practice and spiritual experiences, you can point to a lot of practices like running being spiritual, for example. And I think that's right. And that's where I don't think it's adequate to just look at correlations in terms of kind of what happens after you engage in the practice. This is where I think having a more contextual, holistic view of everything that's at play. So what are the assumptions that are going into play? What is the communal culture? What is the vocabulary around the set of practices? What is the historical backdrop for how these have developed? And it's only when you start contextualizing and really getting a more complete picture of the actual practice that I think you can start to make some determinations. Like, do I think there's some line in the sand where kind of everything here is secular and everything here is religious? No. Can you completely get rid of like religion? No, right? I mean, this is why the language of excessive entanglement in the legal rulings. So how do you quantify? I mean, I think you get at some of the really difficult issues with trying to draw lines and trying to make legal determinations. But that's where I kind of try and play out, well, it's more just than one individual had a spiritual experience when they are in this yoga class. It's like going running. There's a thicker picture to these particular contexts.
So the other comment is about your opt-in model of informed consent. I mean, first of all, some of the examples you give in the book strike me as, why would those be offered on any model? You know, like opt-in or opt-out, they just shouldn't be in school systems. Mm-hmm. And then the other part is, it just seems that sometimes the recommendations you give in the book, like, take this very complex picture and render it more according to a monolithic model, where things that just shouldn't even be in the school systems. Yeah. And then other things like, so what, now we can't have attentional regulation taught in the class, or it's okay to do it, you just can't call it mindfulness, or, which isn't to say mindfulness means attentional regulation, or you can't deal with issues of cultivating empathy or compassion because there's interconnectivity, when in fact we teach separation and isolation all the time in the classroom, but that's okay. So, like, my concern is when you're saying opt-in model of informed consent, what are you actually referring to? Are you referring to those things like the superbrain, arhatic?
Right.
What was that, arhatic tradition?
Arhatic, yeah.
Or are you referring to like taking particular techniques without any nomenclature or any big system at all and using them in the classroom? I just wasn't quite clear on what the model was for.
Yeah, so the question being, like, so does the opt-in model of informed consent get us where we want to go? If some practices really wouldn't be appropriate, opt-in or opt-out, and if it seems to kind of cut out too many practices that may not have the affiliations that are noted. And I mean, I think that these are very fair points to bring. I mean, part of the challenge of trying to have a conclusion that you can get traction with in a book, let alone in a legal testimony where you've got to just have a one-line version of this. It's going to smooth over things that are much more complex. And so I think you have to fill out, you can't stop with this statement, oh, opt-in model informed consent, that solves everything. I don't think that's the case. What I'm trying to get at, though, is if there were a model of transparency with practices, I don't think we would have superbrain yoga in the classrooms, right? So I think that actually becomes a kind of filter to start thinking through, well, what is going to be pedagogically valuable? What is there a scientific foundation for? Where's there a purpose? Like, what's the rationale for doing the practice? So if you just start with the transparency, I think that helps with aspect number one, like what even belongs in the classroom. And I think that also helps to get us at, so my goal here is not to say all contemplative activities are bad, right? Or all mindfulness and yoga is bad. But this partly comes out of there are individuals, there are groups for whom this feels to them, rightly or wrongly, coercive and a violation of conscience. And that's why the voluntary part comes into play as well as the transparency. And there might even be more people who would object to some of the practices that are just like, oh, well, it's common sense, you're mindful, you're non-judgmental, if they understood more of what's behind the practices. So it's not that I'm trying to say attentional regulation is bad, right? I mean, I want to kind of, I think paying attention, like you've got to parse these terms, you've got to flesh them out. But if you at least take the step of being, in a sense, contemplative, reflective about one's own practices, where those practices come from, and are transparent with that, and allow a genuine choice to be involved in those practices or not, I think that gets us some distance away from a lot of the just, I think in some ways, unnecessary cultural controversies. And there might even be a way to ways to invite into healthful, beneficial practices some of the very staunchest opponents of practices that get labeled as things like mindfulness and yoga by people who don't really know a whole lot of what these practices and traditions are. So there might actually be ways to make welcoming, to assuage concerns by just having more kind of extended, robust conversations about these topics. Yeah.
Yeah, I think reading research, I think it's even worse than you implied. First of all, mindfulness can mean almost anything.
Yeah.
The term is so expanded so far beyond. And I think also what's being taught, a lot of things that are called mindfulness are actually self-improvement programs.
Right.
Where they're, I'm going to improve your performance, or I'm going to make you a better person, or I'm going to deal with your work stress rather than having to provide you with decent working conditions. We're just going to teach you to meditate and then tell you that if you're stressed out, it's your fault.
Yeah.
And also the research on the adverse effects. There was a paper that came out recently on some of the adverse effects of doing the practice. And it's self-reported. Mm-hmm. It's a very small sample. They don't define what mindfulness means. They don't define what yoga means. It could be anything.
Yeah.
And some of the things that they reported as unpleasant effects included things like boredom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if your teacher didn't tell you that you're going to be bored when you practice, they shouldn't be teaching.
Right.
So,
yeah.
In addition to all of the problems with trying to set up the research in a legitimate way, I think some of the teaching is really bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no wonder people are having adverse effects.
Right.
Can I just
sure.
tack on to that why are we talking about opting in and opting out for stuff that we're really unclear about the effectiveness of? I was surprised to hear, well, not surprised, but in a lot of these contemplative mindfulness Buddhist circles, the data is overwhelming for how effective it is. And so, of course, we've got to get it into our schools. And so I'm surprised to hear that, not surprised, but just talk a little bit about why is it this panacea when the data is potentially not clear?
Okay, so again, to rephrase, so mindfulness is used in a lot of different ways. Why is it that it gets presented as having a lot of data behind it where that might not always be supported? And what do you do with even some of the weaknesses in studies that point to adverse effects of what mindfulness is? And is mindfulness being used as a replacement for dealing with structural injustice and structural inequality? All of these, I think, are very good observations about some of the way that the word mindfulness has taken on a kind of life of its own. I mean, I think it gets back to kind of what we were talking about in terms of it's a good way of marketing something. Some of the studies that actually show the most neuroscience kind of related benefits with mindfulness are of Buddhist monks who are meditating, so it's not the secularized version of the practice but I think this gets us back to that there's a lot financially, a lot legally, a lot in terms of marketing that's at stake in these practices, and this is where what I try to do and would like to see kind of more of is these very contextual, finely textured examinations. I think if you start saying mindfulness blanket, like have it, don't have it, you're going to get into trouble very, very quickly. But if you look at specific curricula, you look at specific context, then I think you've got a better ability to try and deal with some of these issues. Yeah.
So just on that point, this is something that the field itself is wrestling with, how to do more nuanced, contextual-based studies within the neuroscientific programming and so on and so forth of contemplatives. And what are they actually doing, controlled, randomized controlled trials, etc. However, in your book, which I have read, you take a lot, and even in this presentation, of things like MBSR, and then you're talking about public schools. Well, those are very different, and they're very different sets of research. I mean, MBSR is a clinical trial for stress reduction. That's done largely on adults who, to relieve stress in hospital settings, and is under clinical conditions largely. Fifth graders or third graders, or largely even, from what I can tell you, really, public schools means K through 12, because higher ed wouldn't be a very different opt-in model with adults. But for kids, and Tish can talk about it more as a specialist, but the research programming for mindfulness, yoga excluded, but just on mindfulness and intention-based practices, again, not to conflate them, but let's just call it mindfulness, is very different research body. And as far as I'm aware, there's very little rigorous study on K through 12 kids doing mindfulness. In fact, again, to correct me, but I think there's close to nil that's really.
Yeah, so the observation being that most of the research on mindfulness has been adult, clinical, largely MBSR kinds of settings. I mean, some other. And MBCT, which is a derivative of MBSR. Relatively little research done on children. But when these programs are marketed to schools, it's this broader literature on the adult practices that gets marshaled as an argument for the efficacy of the mindfulness programs, partly because there isn't that big of a body of research, and especially the controlled studies that go beyond self-report data.
I just want to build on that.
Sure.
You cite the Kling-Bell meta-analysis in your book, but you really don't give it justice because it actually shows positive outcomes. You also criticize it in a way that reflects a misunderstanding of the research. Part of it involves effect sizes. What the authors are arguing is that there's different ways in which we intervene in schools. One is at the universal level, and that's for all kids. And then there's these other more targeted interventions that are for kids who have special issues and need more help. When they talk about the effect sizes, they're talking about the universal level, and it's common among all interventions in schools that effect sizes are modest. And you're criticizing them for having low effect sizes. That doesn't make sense. So I just really want you to understand that article that's a meta-analysis actually does show positive impacts of these programs, and you kind of dismiss that. And I think it's important for you to look at that again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this. So the comment being that one of the particular studies that I cite in the book, the argument is if you look more closely at the study, you could actually see kind of larger effect sizes than I give that credit for. And I'll take another look at that study.
I mean, you really need to understand school-based research focused on these kinds of interventions to interpret it appropriately.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd love to have kind of a more extended conversation about exactly that kind of issue. So I welcome that and would love to talk more about that with you. Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the transparency that you envision? From my basic understanding, being introduced just in this lecture, there is not a lot of transparency from the groups who are advocates for mindfulness and yoga in schools, as well as people who are trying to fight against that. And so it seems very unclear. And I'd like to understand a little bit better.
Yeah. So what kind of transparency would I advocate for if what I've suggested is there's not a lot of transparency about these practices? So one of the things, and I want to use the Encinitas Sedlak case as a way of answering that question, because there, what the school district decided and what the court affirmed was as long as you don't talk about the cultural context of the practice, the history, the culture, the background, the Sanskrit, the India, and all you do is the practice, then you're on fine ground. Whereas the reasoning of the Schempp court was that talking about the history and the context is exactly what public education should be doing, rather than encouraging the practice. And so I actually would love to see classes that talk about Joyce and talk about kind of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga, and classes that talk about the background of how the term mindfulness has been popularized and spread and taken on this kind of life of its own. That's the sort of historical, contextual, cultural sort of examination that I think can really be helpful in understanding what practices are, like in this specific context, what this practice is, and where it comes from, and whether someone would want to be a part of that practice. So in some ways, I'm actually suggesting more teaching about contemplative practices, mindfulness, yoga, and that's the sort of transparency that I think could be helpful in navigating some of these other issues, and that would include strengths and weaknesses of scientific evidence. And I mean, this is where, like, sitting down and looking at a particular meta-analysis or looking at a particular study and the background of that study and how it fits in with larger literatures, that's exactly the kind of conversation that I would love to have more of, and I think is often absent in a lot of the literature that's present. And partly it's a matter of a New York Times article or an Atlantic article is just by its nature very brief. But I think there is more space to have even those kinds of debates and those conversations that look into all the factors that are at play historically, culturally, contextually.
Yeah, and to follow up, do you think that if you were to propose this for some of these groups that you talk about, would they be interested in that? It seems like they were purposefully not transparent, saying this is a religion, this is not a religion, or this is stealth Buddhism, etc.
Yeah. I think it depends. So the question is, would groups who want programs in schools and call them stealth Buddhism, for instance, want this kind of conversation? I mean, I think really it's a matter of who you're talking to. There's a lot of variety in why someone would want programs in schools, what they mean by those programs. I've actually been very grateful for the very engaged, thoughtful kinds of reaction that I've gotten from a lot of the people who I've had conversations with about these practices, many of whom lead mindfulness programs of their own, who have a strong investment in the practices, who really have also a very strong ethical commitment to things like transparency, right? To honest speech and doing no harm. So I've been very grateful for the willingness to dialogue that I've encountered as I've been about this research.
So we should probably give you a
Yeah.
break.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.